Hey everybody, Professor Snart checking in as we move out of our previous unit. I'm just logging myself into Blackboard here, which was T.S. Eliot, and into our next unit focused on Virginia Woolf. And so actually in these two units and in the next one, which is Joyce, we have really the opportunity to look at these quintessentially modernist figures. And remember the kind of idea for modernism, or the defining characteristic, is this idea that they wanted to reinvestigate tradition, in some cases to break away from it, in some cases to reconfigure it, in some cases to do both together. Eliot's a good example of that. But we recall maybe Ezra Pound's famous saying, "Make it new," as a good kind of dictum or motto to remember for the modernist age. What we begin to see, though, and this is where it gets a little bit more interesting than just looking at one single figure, is in the figures that we saw coming up in the unit about various kinds of modernisms, where we looked at Yeats, but also the assignment was to look at modernism in terms of a specific movement within that literary or artistic era, or a specific figure. And then looking at Eliot, and now when we look at Woolf, we see that this idea to make it new really plays itself out in a lot of different ways. So it's kind of, again, it's interesting to begin to look at lots of different examples of how experimentation and reconfiguring one's relationship to tradition plays out in all of these different end products. So you can say that someone like Eliot and Woolf are really quintessential modernist figures, but at least on the surface, their work doesn't share a lot that's immediately, obviously, in common, even though they're both really working towards this kind of making it new, or working in consciously experimental ways. I think Woolf's work in particular maybe doesn't strike us quite as jarring as Eliot's, partly because it's fiction as opposed to poetry, but also because the style that she's working in has become a lot more conventional or accepted or identifiable for us now. But at the time, recall, it really was experimental and breaking away from traditional forms and traditional ways of telling stories and of dealing with characters and of disclosing details to the reader. So it's important to see her in context, just like it is really for all of the authors that we study. So before some comments about Woolf, hopefully everyone enjoyed the Eliot unit, where we get to look at this idea about the creative process as it's expressed in these two different mediums and by two very different individuals. The advertising for HP, very modern, contemporary thing, and of course Eliot's own tradition in the individual talent essay, and how that plays out in terms of his actual work, whether it's very famous love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, the famous but much less often read The Wasteland, or even some of his other slightly lesser known works like Journey of the Magi, for example, where he obviously is trying to enact some of the ideas, or out of which he draws some of the ideas for his theories of poetry and creativity and what or who the poet is supposed to be. So a couple of comments then. One of the things that a lot of people noted was what seems to be T.S. Eliot's arrogance, and you're not the first to notice this by all means. And I won't say it's untrue, but I do want to, again, sort of contextualize that just in terms of the style of nonfiction prose, of essay prose at the turn of the 20th century. It's sort of this inflated academic kind of style that I think comes off to us today maybe as a little bit arrogant. So I just don't want to confuse him being a product of his time period with some sort of overblown superiority on his part. I think in many ways he was as self-conscious and nervous as any other artist, even if it doesn't always come across in his poetry or certainly his prose, his essay work. So just to kind of condition that a little bit so that we don't come away with a really negative feeling for Eliot only because his writing just reflects kind of the typical style of his age in some ways. Also, I think a lot of his ideas about emotion and personality in poetry can be taken really the wrong way, and again, maybe taken as evidence of this sort of superiority on his part, but I actually read it very differently. I see it almost the opposite. Because he was so present in his poems, he, I think, went to great lengths to try to say in his theoretical work that he would prefer his readers not simply read for his biography in every single poem. So the I speaker is probably almost always some part of Eliot, but it's a worked up, poetic part. It's an artistic version or a changed version, a creatively reworked version. So even the I voice is not Eliot, and that's kind of what he's trying to say, is that there's this tendency to misread any I voice or even third-person work for what it reveals about the author or the poet. And he's trying to reconfigure how we read for that sort of thing. So again, it comes off as potentially sort of arrogant or pompous or a little too definitive as an argument on his part. But again, I'd like to contextualize that in terms of simply the prose style of the age, but also really the argument that he's trying to put forward as a sort of counter-argument to others that exist before him. And here's where it gets really difficult for us, because obviously we try to see every statement or every poetic work within a certain context, but there's simply no way we can cover all of that context. So you lose a lot of the nuance of all of these arguments in terms of there being responses to arguments or ideas prior to themselves. So we end up seeing them in these very sort of cloistered ways, and we run the risk of coming away from those with sort of limited ideas or misdirected ideas just because we don't have that bigger context, which is just not feasible to ever have in a course like this, but really in any kind of course, you're always limited in terms of the time and just the sheer material you can cover. Okay, so on to Woolf then. She becomes a really fascinating figure because, like I said, she is modernist in the same way that Eliot is, but the way she goes about it and the sort of end product is really different. In fact, when you read something like Mark on the Wall, which is a short piece of fiction, although even that, trying to specify the genre of that becomes difficult. There's maybe no two different works that you could read, Mark on the Wall versus like The Wasteland. They seem completely different. But it's important to see both as part of this modernist experimentation, this modernist movement towards new forms and new modes of expression. Woolf is also interesting because she is, as a female writer, she is then in that tradition of other women writers or feminist writers like Mary Wollstonecraft, like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, like a few other of the figures that we've run into before, and becomes for many later writers this really seminal figure in terms of writing quite specifically about gender and opportunities for female artists, but particularly women writers. So her most famous work, maybe A Room of One's Own, is this very, kind of unapologetic call for what it means to be a woman writer and what women writers need to produce work that's authentic to themselves. And, it's not really that, it's no great demands for, opulent castles or perfect isolation. It's pretty realistic stuff, but again, really counter-revolutionary, or I guess I should say revolutionary, for the time period that she's writing in, where, women don't even go to school, and it's not because they don't want to, it's because they're not allowed in, most of the places. Woolf herself, a good example of this. Her education is derived mostly from just reading on her own, borrowing books from people, because she doesn't have the same educational opportunities that other males in her family member do. So you can imagine something like A Room of One's Own coming out of not these sort of theoretical abstract ideas about gender, but one's very specific, practical, day-to-day experience with these kinds of things. Woolf is also interesting because she worked as a publisher with her husband, Leonard Woolf. They published work by Eliot, work by Joyce, so she was on that end of communicating these modernist works in as wide a way as possible. was, again, important that she, took on roles that weren't just those of writer or artist, but was really deeply involved in developing, modernist ideals, but also, communicating them, helping to communicate them as widely as possible. The Woolf unit doesn't have a lecture slideshow type thing, because there's a really good biography that is part of the DVD extras that come with the movie called The Hours, which I have a trailer for, and is a great movie just on its own if you want to watch it, but also provides, at least a third of it, a really nice view of what the everyday life of someone like Virginia Woolf might have been like, as far as the house she lived in, the conditions she works in, all of those really everyday details that sometimes we forget about because we're so concerned with, what an author stands for and what a work means, and we take it out of the context of their day-to-day lives. What does a chair look like in a Virginia Woolf house, for example? How do people get around? What does other furniture look like? Is there electricity? Is there not? What things are considered a luxury and all that sort of stuff? Just those everyday practical realities that obviously, and this is counterintuitive, right? We know they have a deep impact on individuals. We know this from our own lives. But how often do we take the time to really investigate what some of those practical day-to-day living conditions are like in terms of our study of authors? So we know they're important, but we also know that we kind of ignore them because we're often after the big picture or the big idea kind of thing. Okay, so for those of you who really detested Eliot, again, you're not alone, but Woolf should be a nice, what would you say? I don't want to say opposite, even though it might appear that way, but maybe just a nice change of pace. Let's put it that way. And then we get into Joyce in the unit after Woolf, who again is yet another change of pace, good or bad. You can make that decision once we get there. Okay, as always, be in touch with any questions, and I'll talk to everybody soon.